Anyway, let's get on with the serious stuff. Let's get on with the questions. Here's a question from Jack.
Hello, I'm Jack Jameson. I'm currently doing the MA in Government Studies at King's College London, and I'm a student of EDS on the Chancellors and the Treasury module. My question is, should economic decisions be restricted to Treasury Ministers and the Prime Minister, or is there scope for full Cabinet discussion? For example, were the 1976 IMF Cabinet discussions a dangerous farce, as suggested by Ed Mundell, or arguably the finest display of collective Cabinet government, as is the view of Peter Hennessy?
Great question from Jack there, a student on a course called the Treasury and Economic Policy since 1945, which I've taught for 10 years now with former Permanent Secretary Nick Macpherson, Professor John Davis, part of what is now an MA in Government Studies, which is being taught as a master's degree for King's students. And I think you've been along, George. You came to do the final class as Chancellor of the Exchequer 1 year. Last week we had Jeremy Hunt come along and take questions from the students. And the cool thing about the course is, as well as full-time master students, there's now been over 250 Treasury civil servants in their 20s into their early 30s who have done the class as part of their job, as part of learning institutional history, paid for by the Treasury, strongly backed by the Permanent Secretary. So it's a really good class. And this is exactly the kind of thing we talk about how Cabinet, Prime Ministers, Chancellors have interacted and made good or bad decisions over past decades.
Should I have a first go answering this and see what you think? See whether I would pass your class. So, Jack is right in the kind of technical sense that some of the key tax and spending decisions are not Cabinet decisions. So tax policy is the preserve of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. It's not the collective responsibility of the Cabinet. Very unusually. I mean, there are some, of course, military decisions that are the kind of prerogative of the Prime Minister, but tax policy is the prerogative of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. And in practice, the Treasury has a lock on many spending decisions because an item can't be put on the Cabinet agenda by number 10 and a Cabinet Minister can't request it be put on the Cabinet agenda if it has a spending implication that has not been agreed or signed off by the Treasury. So the Treasury has two kind of extraordinary powers. One is, as I say, a kind of exclusive power on tax policy with the Prime Minister, and second, it can stop things going on the Cabinet agenda. But I would just say in practice, and this is what happened in 1976, the Cabinet is just it's like a sort of safety valve. Normal cabinets just sign things off, and they're kind of perfectly good moments to discuss things, but they're not a sort of decision-making body as such. Where they really come into their own is when parties are deeply divided or when there's not a majority in Parliament. And the reality is you have to broker a deal in your Cabinet, whatever the unwritten constitution implies. And that was the case, I think, in Jim Callaghan's time in 1976. Labour was deeply divided in its Cabinet. And if you think of the coalition I was part of, the idea that just me and David Cameron could have decided on tax policy was a nonsense. We had to get the sign-off of Nick Clegg and Danny Alexander because otherwise we didn't have a majority when those votes came in Parliament. So I would say, the realpolitik is you have to have a majority in Parliament, and if that requires you to broker deals in the Cabinet, discuss them in the Cabinet, or set up some alternative system to, talk to another political party, then that's what you have to do. Whatever the Constitution says.
That's right. And there have been even more extreme examples of Prime Ministers choosing not to follow that convention. If you look at the Cabinet meetings after the devaluation of 1967, when Jim Callaghan had resigned and Roy Jenkins had become the new Chancellor, Wilson, as Prime Minister, actually got Jenkins to advocate to the Cabinet for particular tax decisions and then took a vote in the Cabinet as to whether the Cabinet would support them, with Wilson himself reserving his position and having the casting vote. So if he felt the Cabinet was going to be against his Chancellor's decision, he would decide to be against it as well. I don't think we've seen votes on tax matters in the modern era, but you are completely right. In 76, at a time when there was an IMF loan was needed, and you had voices, Tony Benn, Dick Crossland, strongly opposing what was being done by Denis Healey as Chancellor, Jim Callaghan as Prime Minister. Those cabinet discussions lasted many hours. And the same thing actually happened in 1992 in the ERM crisis, the day Britain left the exchange rate mechanism. It wasn't formally in the cabinet, but John Major had gathered together senior cabinet figures, Ken Clarke, Douglas Hurd.
Who wasn't Chancellor?
He wasn't Chancellor. The Chancellor was Norman Lamont, and John Major was the Prime Minister, but they wanted other cabinet ministers to be part of the decision making. And I think the lesson is that if you, as you said, either have no majority or a very small majority, or you have a massive crisis, then in those situations, binding the cabinet into the decision becomes really an imperative. Whereas in other times, in the early period of Blair and Brown, when there was a large majority and there wasn't a crisis, the two of them could essentially decide what was to happen, and the cabinet just agreed. There wasn't a formal vote or anything. The one time Tony Blair did use the cabinet was on the issue of the euro in 2003, where he asked Gordon Brown to present to the cabinet the 5 tests assessment on the euro, not for an hour, but in a series of meetings which lasted 2 or 3 hours at a time over weeks and weeks and weeks, because I think he wanted the cabinet to have the opportunity to challenge the decision. What actually happened was the cabinet listened to all of the Treasury assessment and concluded that we didn't really want to join the euro. So in the end, it ended up being a very binding thing.
Didn't they actually come to the assessment that Gordon Brown was likely to be the next Prime Minister, and they didn't want to get on the wrong side of him?
There was also a bit of that.
The 6th assessment.
That is
the
right.
6th Treasury test.
That's right. I think Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves will not have asked for the Cabinet's approval on decisions they've made in the last few months on taxation or on spending, and they may not even have consulted senior members of the Cabinet. But there is always a risk in that as Prime Minister, and it's something you always have to be aware of for the realpolitik reasons that you said. But it reflects the nature of the relationship and the nature of, and the standing of the government as well as the crisis. And that's exactly the kind of thing that we study in our King's College London Masters class. And Jack's been a great student, and thank you for a very good question. Let's go on to our next